This is Tony Pappard with Promethean Action. As we're talking here today, a new Christian renaissance is unfolding in the United States and around the world. We call it the third Christian Renaissance because we consider the movement unleashed by Jesus Christ and his apostles to have been the first Christian Renaissance, and the second one unfolded in Europe in between roughly 1300 and 1500. Over the last century, the Christian civilization created by that last great Renaissance has been weakening and dying and practically dead. But now we're in a position to bring it back greater than ever before, not as it was, but a deeper and fuller and richer version of Christian civilization with new discoveries in science, in art, and even new discoveries in the Christian religion itself. As it seems to me, Dante's Commedia marked a higher development of Christianity than had ever existed before. You're watching the weekly class of Promethean Action for January 24th, 2026. And if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure and press like and subscribe underneath the video to increase our reach on YouTube. We began this series 2 weeks ago, and I'll include that YouTube video in the chat in a few minutes. Tonight, historian Robert Ingram is going to outline the struggle over the nation state, the republic or commonwealth, and national sovereignty, which took place in the last great Renaissance, roughly 1300 to 1500, and is being fought out today, every day, as you see with what President Trump said and did in Davos, Secretary Bessent, and Secretary Lutnick, the Trump's World Peace Organization. All these things continue on an even deeper and fuller level, the fight for sovereignty from the great Renaissance 500 plus years ago. And I will follow up Bob's remarks on the fight in science over the past 100 years especially, and Paul Glumaz will conclude. And then we'll have discussion, questions and answers, and the like. So with that, let me pass it to Bob.
Hello, everyone. Good to be back here with you. So, as Tony referenced the question of the very recent Davos summit and everything that went on there. I'm not going to go into that at all, except to say that it should be very clear to everyone that what was announced there by President Trump and others is that the era of globalization is over. And that we are returning to the constitutional principle of the sovereign nation state. And I'm going to talk tonight about national sovereignty. Now, some people might react to that by saying, well, what does national sovereignty have to do with a Christian Renaissance? And the reality is it has a lot to do with it. It has a lot to do with it. The sovereign nation state was created by the last Christian Renaissance, beginning in the late 14th and then into the 15th century. Prior to that, you had the Christian religion, you had Christian principles, but what you also had was oligarchical rule almost everywhere, rule by the elite, the few, in which the vast majority of human beings were treated like cattle or mules, beasts of burden. Human beings were expendable. Now, Christianity, through the new dispensation of Jesus Christ, said that all human beings are sacred, that all can walk in imitation of Christ. The challenge that was posed during the last Christian Renaissance is that if one were to live by those tenets as to the nature of the human individual made in God's image, the challenge was to create a human society in which this could be realized, because it could not be realized under oligarchical rule. A society where science, progress, and creativity could flourish. Now, what I'm going to do in my portion of this presentation here is I am primarily going to read to you quotes over a span of almost 400 years, quotes from various individuals, as you will see. And that is going to be the bulk of what I'm going to present, because I want to give people a sense of how this battle for the creation of the sovereign nation state proceeded and the principles upon which it proceeded over a long span of time. So with that, why don't you put up the first slide, Tony? And just leave these slides up until I tell you to take them down. All right, so the first slide is from Dante Alighieri. You see the picture of him there. And this is from a work he wrote in 1317 called De Monarchia. He actually wrote this while he was completing the Paradiso. And there's this false historical, well, I don't know, just what some historians say is that Dante, who everyone admits had been very political early in his life, that he had abandoned politics and abandoned civil affairs when he was writing the Divine Comedy. And nothing could be further from the truth, because De Monarchia and the Paradiso were written simultaneously at the same time. So I'll read to you the quote, and you can read along. All men on whom the higher nature has stamped the love of truth should especially concern themselves in laboring for posterity, in order that future generations may be enriched by their efforts, as they themselves were made rich by the efforts of generations past. For that man who is imbued with public teachings but cares not to contribute something to the public good is far in arrears of his duty. He is indeed not, quote, a tree planted by the rivers of water that bringeth forth his fruit in his season, unquote, but rather a destructive whirlpool, always engulfing and never giving back what it has devoured. I desire for the public weal to bear fruit and to establish truths unattempted by others. It is therefore again manifest that this liberty is the greatest gift bestowed by God on mankind. By it alone, we gain happiness as men. By it alone, we gain happiness elsewhere as gods. But if this is so, who will say that humankind is not in its best state when it can most use this principle? So the liberty, love of mankind, fighting for the future. And this work, De Monarchia, is a work in which Dante goes through exactly the type of state he is proposing. But, it's not a recipe. What he's addressing, what the question he is posing, is the nature of the human identity required for the advancement of the human species. One of the things throughout the work is that Dante makes repeated references to the sacred example of Cincinnatus, the famous Roman citizen soldier. And it becomes very clear that Dante's true subject is the moral basis for a free citizenry. He has an extensive investigation into the subject of free will, wherein he states that animals do not possess free will because they are governed by appetites. But man is free to develop his goodness, his intellectual powers, and the society within which he lives. That in this manner, man is truly free. So he's laying out the basis at the highest level of how society should be governed. And it is very, among other things, very anti-oligarchical. All right, put up the next slide, Tony. All right, the picture there, that is Nicholas of Cusa. And this is just a short quote from a work he wrote in 1433. So this is about 100 years after Dante, called Concordantia Catholica. And I'll just read to you the quote. There is in the people a divine seed by virtue of their common equal birth and the equal natural rights of all men, so that all authority, which comes from God as does man himself, is recognized as divine when it arises from the common consent of all the subject. This is that divinely ordained marital state of spiritual union based on a lasting harmony by which a commonwealth is guided in the fullness of peace toward eternal bliss. So Cusa introduces this concept of the commonwealth. Again, a self-governing society on behalf of the common good based on the highest principles of man's relationship with God. And, what he is addressing is the divine spark of reason which exists in all human beings, that which distinguishes us from the beasts. And this is really, and I'm not exaggerating here, stretching the point, at least not in my view, this is really the basis for what later became the American Republic. Again, based on freedom, liberty, but based on a concept of man fundamentally different from how most of humanity had existed for millennia under oligarchical rules. Empires have always striven to extinguish this concept of man from the planet and to relegate the human species to the servile conditions which existed under the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire has always been the model that has been followed by medieval and modern imperial rule. This, on the other hand, the sovereign nation state allows for true freedom and true human advancement. And it was Cusa who established the principle of the Commonwealth, a nation state dedicated to the common good and governed by Christian charity, agape. All right, put up the next slide, Tony. This is a picture of Louis XI of France. Now, Louis XI is an individual. He was the King of France. He wrote a book called The Rosebush of War in 1483, so this is about 50 years after Cusa. and this is coming directly out of the Christian Renaissance of that era. Lyndon LaRouche often referred to him as the creator of the first modern sovereign nation state. And that's true. And this directly came out of the principles enunciated that I read to you by Dante, by Cusa, and by others, out of the Renaissance. But it's, you can't think of this just simply in terms of politics or government. You have to look at the principles upon which the nation state that was created by Louis XI, the principles upon which that was founded. So he wrote this book called The Rosebush of War, and I'll read to you the quote from that. Considering that the characteristic of kings and princes is that their estate and vocation is to defend the common good, both ecclesiastic and secular, and to uphold justice and peace among their subjects, and to do good, they will have good in this world and in the other, and out of doing evil will only come grief. And because the common good, which concerns many, which is the public matter of the realm, is more praiseworthy than the particular, we have gladly put in writing the deeds of princes, of their knights, and all the good tenants that serve their cause. And that is exactly what he does in this work, going through many examples of rulers who acted on the basis of the common good, which is coherent with Cusa's concept of the commonwealth. And if you look at what is occurring here, people, the way this is presented in history books is that this is some sort of mechanistic evolution. It's not. The concept of the commonwealth, the concept of a sovereign nation state based on the common good, this was a discovery. This was a new universal principle of how human society must be organized, such that the actual nature of men and women, could flourish, could emerge, and if you look at what Louis XI did, among other things, some of the practical things he did while he was king, acting on behalf of this Commonwealth principle, he built ports, he built roads, he built schools to raise literacy, he built printing houses, he created industry, he built infrastructure, he created a national currency, and he broke the power, the feudalistic power of the baronies, of all the little local oligarchs, and created a unified nation state based on progress and science and industry, all of which was intended to benefit the people. Put up the next slide, Tony. All right, this is a very short quote. This is from Machiavelli, who you see there. And this is in 1517, so this is about 30 years after Louis XI. And he wrote a book called Discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livius, which not very many people today have read, but it was one of his major works. And this is a book about how you create a republic. That's what the book is about. How a republic can be created, how it can be governed, and how it can be defended militarily. It is a declaration of war against the oligarchical class. He attacks oligarchical corruption and the corruption of society. He says that a republic is impossible in a state which tolerates an idle nobility, which controls castles and vassals and treats them like farm animals. In book 2, he says, and this is the quote that's on the screen, it is the well-being not of individuals, but of the community which makes a state great. And without question, this universal well-being is nowhere secured save in a republic. And it was Dante who was the champion and one of the primary leaders of the Florentine Republic, which was overthrown at a certain point by the oligarchical interests in Italy and elsewhere. He returns in this work, these discourses, Machiavelli returns again and again to his central question, which is the citizenry, the uplifting of the citizenry, and not coincidentally, he takes up again, as Dante had done 200 years earlier, he takes up again the subject of Cincinnatus, and as the model of a citizen, and discusses Cincinnatus at some depth. And what he gets at is that the real issue is the development of the cognitive abilities, the cognitive power of the citizenry, something that is impossible under oligarchical rule. And he stresses that the republic must always act on behalf of the common good. All right, put up the next slide, Tony. Okay, this is the Pilgrims, the Mayflower Compact, 1620. And before I get into it, I want to make one little sort of reference here, which is, although I'm sure no one on this call, or probably no one on this call, knows this, but today, January 24th, is the birthday of William Brewster. He was born in 1570. He was born, people tend to think of Machiavelli as someone from like the Middle Ages or something, someone from way back, whereas the Pilgrims are more like the modern era, the creation of America. But the fact is, William Brewster was born only 43 years after Machiavelli died, right? So that's 1 to 2 generations after the death of Machiavelli. William Brewster is born in 1570, and he was the leader of the Pilgrims who arrived at Plymouth Rock. He was so anyway. In 1620, 41 passengers on board the Mayflower signed a compact, in which they committed themselves to combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. And I'll read to you the quote that's on the screen. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten have undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. And we do solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. And now, 10 years later, after the landing of the Pilgrims and the establishment of the Plymouth colony, 10 years later in 1630, John Winthrop and his friends and allies and followers landed in Boston and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And if you read Winthrop's famous speech from that, which he issued right before they left England, you will see that this mission to the New World by the Puritans was founded explicitly on the principle of the common good. And then in the years after 1630, the decades after 1630, under Winthrop's leadership, Massachusetts enacted laws and measures for public education, internal improvements, the creation of a citizens' militia. In fact, the first citizens' militia that I know of, at least the first that I'm aware of, had been created by Machiavelli to defend Florence. But anyway, Winthrop's, one of the things they did, public education, internal improvements, a citizens' militia. They also established a credit system through the issuance of the Pine Tree Shilling and used it to finance science, industry, and things such as the Saugus Iron Works, which we discussed in an earlier class. And this really is, and you won't hear many historians say this, but this really is the realization of Machiavelli's republic in the New World. Progress, scientific advancement, human creativity, a commitment to the common good, and it's reborn on the shores of the New World. So the next slide, Tony. And this is the last one. All right. So this is the picture at the top are the members of the Continental Congress signing the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And I will just read to you those two short quotes. The first is from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's all I'll read from the Declaration of Independence. But then from the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, or I guess this is the entire preamble, I think so, I'm not sure. But it is, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And this is what was created, a nation based on Christian free will, based on creativity, based on the common good. You know, if you read history books by almost everyone, they will say that the U.S. Constitution is based, and the Declaration of Independence are based on the ideas of John Locke. This is just an outright lie, a fabrication. If you read Locke's premier political work, his two treatises on government, you will be shocked by what you read. Because what he says in there, and I am not making this up, is that human beings are beasts, they're animals, they're governed by their passions, right? And what you need to do is to create a, quote, social contract, a social contract in which you can come to some agreement of how you're going to, keep the beasts, that is the people, how you're going to keep them in line, how you're going to keep them from killing each other. And it's all based on force, using force to enforce the social contract. That is not what America was based on. If you know, I'm going to conclude here, but the if you go back and you really think this through, from what Dante, the same individual who wrote the Divine Comedy, what he is discussing, what Machiavelli is discussing, what others are discussing, the Pilgrims in 1620, they're creating a new society which recognizes that human beings are sacred, that they are made in God's image, that we have the ability to walk in imitation of Christ, to be governed by that, to you know, and the intention is to build a nation in freedom, in which that can flourish, free from oligarchical rule, for the betterment of each and every citizen, for all of the people. And that is really what America is. And it is a direct product, I believe, flowing directly from the last Christian Renaissance. So that's what I wanted to say, Tony.
Thanks so much, Bob. So, Bob has shown us where we got our sovereignty from, where we got our republic from. We got it from the last great Christian Renaissance, and we're getting it back through a new, even greater Christian Renaissance. Now, I want to talk about the question of science. It's a big topic, and I really can't do it justice, but we'll return to it in future shows, and I'll give some indication of what we'll return to. But um, the other basis, or another, as I wrote in the announcement for this class, uh, besides the republic, the Commonwealth, the sovereign nation, the other basis for the greatness of America, which equally came from the last great Christian Renaissance, is science. I mean, science, as it has flourished in the past in our country and in other locations, especially in Europe, was based fully on a Christian notion, which I'll describe to some extent in a moment. But nevertheless, even though, Christianity was 1,500 years old, or 1,500 years old, it wasn't until the last great Renaissance that science was invented, was discovered. It never existed before. I mean, there was an approximation in the ancient Greek science of Plato and others, but science, in a full sense, never existed before the last great Christian Renaissance. And as all of you must be aware, I mean, we have lost science, especially over the past 100 years. Really, it's a longer period. But we've lost science. It's been whittled away. It's become phony. A lot of it is just propaganda, as you saw during COVID. We've lost science. And I mean, the place I would begin to discuss that is, why has there been no fundamental scientific breakthrough since World War I? The last big breakthroughs were, Einstein's final formulation of the theory of general relativity in 1915, Planck's quantum principle around 1900, which was further developed by Einstein in subsequent years. But since World War I, no fundamental scientific breakthrough. Why? Well, I mean, in part, the horror of that war, which, I mean, Europe, for all that's happened since, it's been more than 100 years, Europe has still not fully recovered from World War I. This was a real horror show of mass, meaningless, useless death of young people. I mean, I think England, Britain, lost 20% of the total population of military age men. It's unbelievable. Australia, similarly, actually, and many other countries. Italy never recovered from World War One. Beyond just the horror of war, though, there were those from the oligarchy, from our opponents, who used the horror of war to enforce despair, anti-human skepticism, cynicism, pessimism, despair. And I mean, this came in the midst of something which Paul Gloomas has studied intensively. I'm sure he'll report for us in the future. It came in the midst of a long-running British campaign to discredit and destroy Christianity, which went very notably from the latter part of the 19th century, pretty much into the present day. So, I mean, that was reflected in science as a crackdown in favor of atheism, positivism, materialism. And the most immediate targets of it in the early 20th century were Planck and Einstein, especially Einstein, because Einstein was considered more vulnerable to it. So what you had in coming to a peak, let's say in 1927, was what's called the fight around quantum theory, where Einstein, who had actually invented quantum theory in his paper on the photoelectric effect and subsequent work, Einstein was accused of not understanding quantum theory, and Einstein was victimized in a campaign for irrationalism, which, is a campaign against Einstein. It was a campaign against science, from which science suffers very much to the present day. So this reflects the fight in 1927 and thereafter, and all the way to Einstein's death in 1953, actually, the fight between Einstein and Niels Bohr on science, where Bohr said against Einstein, there is no quantum world. There is only a quantum mechanical description. There's no quantum world. There's a description of something which doesn't exist. There's only a description. It is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature. So Planck is saying, there's no science, there's just irrationality. Now, I mean, Planck kept redefining his positions, and he was characterized as being the Copenhagen school, since that's where he was from. But there really isn't any such thing as the Copenhagen school. Planck fought for irrationality. And he fought against reason and against science in the name of irrationality. And Einstein, was
Tony,
baited and responded and fought this.
Planck or Bohr?
I mean, yeah, I'm sorry. No, forgive me. Thanks for correcting me. I said Planck, I meant Bohr. Bohr was characterized as the Copenhagen school, but he really changed his position all the time. Bohr fought Einstein on this question, and Einstein fought back until his death. And in response to these kinds of utterances by Bohr, Einstein said, I still believe in the possibility of a model of reality. That is to say, of a theory that represents things themselves and not merely the probability of their occurrence. And this was against a strictly statistical view of physics, that events on the micro scale are unknowable or they don't happen at all, just probabilities. So Einstein said, I still want a physics which represents realities, not just probabilities. In a similar line, he said, God does not play dice with men. Again, in this continuing conflict with Niels Bohr and others who supported him, Einstein says, it is basic for physics that one assumes a real world existing independently from the act of perception. But this we do not know. He says here, we assume a real world, we can't prove it. We don't know it for sure. Regardless of whether we know it for sure, what we are trying to understand is existence and reality, not Bohr's thing, what we can say. We're trying to understand existence and reality. And then, similarly, along the same lines, Einstein said, I have no better expression than religious for confidence in the rational nature of reality, insofar as it is accessible to human reason. I have a religious confidence in the rational nature of reality, insofar as it is accessible to human reason. Whenever this feeling is absent, this religious feeling for the rational nature of reality, whenever this is absent, science degenerates into uninspired empiricism. So that's a reflection of the fight in science. And that fight in science has been lost. I mean, we have lost it in the past. The Einstein spent the last 20 years of his life at Princeton, where he died, and he said, the people at Princeton regard me as an old fool. He was told that science had passed him by. He was basically sent out to pasture. But, it was lost, but now it can be won. Just as really, me and the other people, Bob and Paul on this school, worked for decades with Lyndon LaRouche and fighting for the same things we're fighting for now with President Trump. And what Lyndon LaRouche sometimes said is, well, we lost every fight. And we did. We lost every fight, but now, ultimately, at the end, we're winning. So, science, from 1927 to date, science lost every fight. Science was crushed. Science was forced into retreat. Science was forced into concessions, even just plain, corruption, as you saw under COVID. But now science is fighting forward. Science is in a position to win in this new Christian Renaissance. Now, what I want to contrast with is Johannes Kepler. Again, much could be said about Kepler. He wrote numerous books. He made numerous discoveries. Kepler was the inventor of modern physics. And, the fame and credit which many misinformed people give to Isaac Newton should go to Kepler. Newton's laws were simply an algebraic reformulation of Kepler's laws, derived far earlier by Kepler. Kepler, if you want to know when Kepler lived, it's a date centering around 1600, before and after 1600. Kepler was when he became an astronomer, Kepler was studying to become a Lutheran minister. Did really, I think, all the education required for a Lutheran minister, but went into astronomy, saying, I can serve God and praise God through my astronomy. His view was, we must learn. And Einstein said the same thing. Einstein said, I want to know what God was thinking when he created this. And what Kepler said about his astronomy is, nothing is fashioned by God without a plan. He considered the visible, the universe, the visible image of God, as is implied in Romans 1, verse 20. Um, the He was a follower of the great Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, whom Bob put up on the screen on the question of the Christian Commonwealth. But Cusa was also a founder of science, and Kepler explicitly followed him. Kepler said, God intended that we should discover the plan of creation by sharing in his thoughts, just like Einstein in that quotation I quoted. And Kepler, so Kepler's starting point was because he discovered the order of the planets, their orbits, their speed in their orbits, the relationship of their orbits to each other, all these things, which then was, taken by Newton and refashioned into Newton's supposed discoveries. So the basis on which Kepler stood ultimately was the same as Plato and Pythagoras, where, as Kepler himself said, where Plato and Pythagoras uh, studied the 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 regular polygons and the Platonic solids. So the regular polygons are the equilateral, they're plane figures which have equal angles and equal sides. So they are the equilateral triangle, which you see here, even though it's stretched. You see another one here, see another one here. The square, 4 equal sides, and the pentagon, 5 equal sides. And then the regular polygons go up, infinitely to the hexagon, heptagon, octagon, and so on and so forth. But of all these regular polygons, only 5 regular solids can be made, meaning solids which have regular polygons for faces, the same polygon in each solid, equal angles, equal sides, and so forth. So here are those 5 regular polygons. And this was the starting point for Pythagoras and for Plato in his work called Timaeus on the creation of the universe. So we have the 4-sided tetrahedron, the 6-sided made of equilateral triangles, the 6-sided cube made of squares, the 8-sided octagon, again made of equilateral triangles, the 12-sided dodecahedron made of regular pentagons, and the 20-sided icosahedron made of, again, equilateral triangles. So what Pythagoras, Plato, and then Kepler understood is that there's a fundamental characteristic of space which allows only these regular polyhedra to exist within space. So Kepler said, well, God would have to have taken this into account in designing the solar system. And as a quite young man in his 20s, I think it was, he showed in a preliminary way, which then he spent the rest of his career proving rigorously, he showed in a preliminary way that indeed these regular polyhedra, which I showed you, dictated the size of the planetary orbits, their relations to each other, or their size relations to each other, or in other words, their nest from smallest to largest, the intervals between them, and the eccentricity of their orbits. That is, in another great discovery, he showed that the planetary orbits were not circles, as had been believed since the beginning of time, for eternity, that they were not circles, but ellipses. So the the uh, the nesting of the regular polyhedra similarly determined the eccentricity, that is, the stretched outness or squashness of these planetary orbits. So, I mean, this was another path for science. This was the path which actually succeeded and got somewhere until it was stamped out more recently. But now we're going to return to that, uh, as I say, on a higher and deeper and better level. Now, we'll have a future class on this, but many scientists are actually doing this, are trying to do it and succeeding to some significant extent. The one I would mention right now, if you want to look at him, is Dr. Michael Levin, Levin, of Tufts. He is doing a tremendous amount of work on what he sometimes calls a Platonic science, or the Platonic space, in a very similar sense to Kepler, and has gathered a great many others who were doing other work and discussing it and so forth. So that's just an indication that the times are changing, and we're at the launch point of another Christian Renaissance. So with that, I turn it over to Paul as our final speaker, and then we'll go into questions and answers discussion.